Hello everybody, welcome back to Comedian MTG. My name is Ian. Today we are covering the Warhammer 40k Commander decks. For those who don't know, Magic has started a new thing called Universes Beyond. It started with the Walking Dead and Stranger Things IP crossovers, also Godzilla. Basically, it's different IPs or intellectual properties crossing over into the Magic the Gathering universe, and these cards are legal in Legacy, Commander, and Vintage. Therefore, it is time to talk about some Warhammer 40k cards for the competitive EDH format. There are currently 4 Commander decks, each one based around a different sort of tribe or clan in the Warhammer 40k universe, and I pulled all the cards that I think are cEDH relevant out of those decks, and we're going to break them down today. Now, there are definitely going to be cards that maybe you in the audience think I completely missed, or maybe there are cards that you're thinking, there's no way that I ever see cEDH play. And if you have opinions and stuff like that, make sure to leave it down in the comments below, because I love having conversations about stuff like this. There's always stuff that I glaze over or that I can't, analyze the first time I look through these spoilers. So I love hearing things from the comments down below that help me innovate as much as you all down in the audience. Without any further ado, let's start with our first spoiler here. We have Abaddon the Despoiler. Now, when this card was first shown to me, I said, okay, why do we want a worse Yidris Maelstrom Wielder? Abaddon the Despoiler is a 5/5 with trample, and it says, during your turn, spells you cast from your hand with mana value X or less have Cascade, where X is the total amount of life your opponents have lost this turn. Now, Abaddon's kind of interesting in comparison with Yidris because a couple things. So first of all, say you have an effect that deals damage to your opponents before Abaddon actually comes down. So say you have something like a Lobber Crew, I don't know, something that deals 1 damage to all of your opponents, and you play Abaddon that turn. Unlike Yidris, you don't need to go to combat and attack with Abaddon to actually get its ability to trigger. However, when Yidris deals combat damage to an opponent, it cascades no matter what the mana value. So I think there's a little bit of give and take between the two of them. Now, Yidris grants you access to a 4th color, which is obviously super strong, but it's also harder to cast, right? Yidris can't have a mana crypt be used in its cost whatsoever, whereas like a Jeweled Lotus for Abaddon means you only have to have 2 lands and a Jeweled Lotus to be able to cast this commander. So it's actually a lot easier to cast than something like Yidris, despite it being a color less. So there's a little bit of give and take for this card. I think it's pretty interesting. I'm interested to see what people do with it. I'm a big Yidris fan in general, but a big part of the appeal for me with Yidris is the ability to use green cards and do some like crazy stuff with like Manamorphose and a bunch of other stuff like that, the Yawgmoth's Will in green. So it's definitely interesting. I definitely have a much higher opinion of this card than when I first saw it because of a lot of the things I mentioned, especially the Jeweled Lotus math. It definitely affects it a good amount, but it's a bit of give and take, as I said, with Yidris, and I'm interested to see whether this card actually ends up seeing play. Marnius Calgar is an Esper 5-mana 3/5 double strike, so already some pushed aggro stats. It has whenever 1 or more tokens enter the battlefield under your control, draw a card. Now, note the or more here, that's pretty important. But it also has pay 6 generic mana, create 2/2/2 white Astartes warrior creature tokens with Vigilance. Also, sorry if I mispronounce any of these creature types. I am not a Warhammer 40k type. This card's really interesting. The first thing people pointed out with this card is that it's kind of broken with cards like Smothering Tithe, but to me that's kind of where this ends as far as like the really busted interactions for like cards you'd already be playing in Esper. The version that I've been tinkering with, I like tried to make a mid-range version, and it's playing cards like Malcolm and like Treasure Robber, which they both deal combat damage and create you treasure tokens. Some people were talking about Monastery Mentor way back from the cons block. And there's a lot of different things that can make you tokens, but making tokens isn't really what you're trying to be doing in cEDH. And it's a little bit of a slow strategy in comparison to like a lot of the busted stuff we can be doing in the format. Now, this card is an Isochron Scepter Outlet, but Isochron Scepter Outlets are a dime a dozen, and when you compare it to something like playing a Tymna Thrasios, you really want this card to have additional benefits apart from just being a Scepter Outlet. I was talking with some people recently where I was actually saying I actually really like this as a stacks commander. Instead of sort of going for this like mid-rangey plan where you play a bunch of token creators that aren't really doing a lot for your mid-range plan and then have that weird contradiction, I kind of like the idea of just staxing the board out, playing your Marnius, applying a ton of pressure to your opponent's life totals, while also playing cards like Grim Hireling, which are like using the double strike to make you a bunch of treasure and drawing you cards and like slowly gaining you advantage that way. And being a stacks deck, you can kind of go lower on your card advantage because you have this 6 mana, make 4 power worth of bodies that also draws you a card ability attached to your commander. When you're playing a stacks list, an ability like that creates a certain inevitability to the game. So despite it not really being the angle a lot of people are taking right away, I actually really like this as a stacks commander. And depending what stacks pieces you're using, you still can kind of win through rule of law effects. So if you play something like a power artifact on a Grim monolith or a Basalt monolith, you can still make infinite colorless mana with only having to cast one spell as opposed to going through the Isochron Scepter stuff. And that just creates infinite colorless mana that you can pump into your commander and then make a ton of bodies and then go to your next turn and just actually beat your opponents to death, which I think is pretty cool. So there's definitely a lot of play to this card, and finding the right build for it I think is going to be extremely interesting. I think that's going to be the thing that people struggle with the most, is like finding the right way to build this card. But I'm very interested in the stacks avenue, and I really want to spend some time looking into it. I have a preliminary version of the deck that I've been working on, but it definitely needs a lot more time before I become comfortable like saying, oh yeah, this is the version I want to play right now. Motech the Stormlord. Now this is one that I didn't expect to like a lot of, but the more I kept reading it, the more I thought this card actually seems pretty interesting. It's a 4 mana 3/3, and whenever one or more artifact cards leave your graveyard, create 2/2/2 black Necron Warrior artifact creature tokens. And at the beginning of combat on your turn, another target artifact creature control gets +2/+2 and gains menace. That second part, not really the relevant part here. The part that I'm interested in is that first part, where anytime an artifact leaves your graveyard at all, you're getting 4 power, split among 2 bodies that also you can passively pump with your commander. So to me, I was thinking about things like the old KCI modern deck, where you're playing things like Mirror Retriever and Scrapyard Recombiner and stuff like that, and you're just like sacrificing your artifact to bring another artifact out of the graveyard, which then you can sacrifice that to bring a different artifact back out, and then suddenly you're like generating infinite mana and infinite bodies, and just kind of having that on the board ready to kill your opponents, and then like having an outlet for the infinite mana, or having just a, I'm gonna assemble this like pretty easy to assemble combination of cards because of all like the redundancy, because you have like Ashnod's Altar, you have Krark Clan Ironworks, you have a bunch of different cards that allow you to like create this sort of sacrifice loop engine. And with the fact that Motech is giving you extra bodies, using even a card like Phyrexian Altar, which only makes you 1 mana when you sacrifice something, becomes still very easy to go infinite with. So I can easily see some really just super basic like infinite artifact recursion loops that, because of how much this commander gives you, becomes rather trivial. So as I said, 4 power for 1 artifact leaving your graveyard is kind of insane. Now, once again, this is another thing, it says 1 or more. So don't get confused and think like, if I exile my whole graveyard full of artifacts, I'm gonna get like 50 power, because that's not quite how that works. But the things I was talking about, the loops I was mentioning, they're all individual cards, artifacts leaving the graveyard, and they're creating loops, but they're still happening 1 instance at a time, and therefore that's why you can sort of pop off with that combo. So I think there's definitely some really busted stuff you can do with this commander, and I'm interested to see if it's linear and cohesive and redundant enough to just kind of create a cEDH deck out of. So it's kind of cool stuff. Also, you can play some like passive stacks that doesn't really affect your stuff, which I always am a huge fan of, is having asymmetrical stacks effects. So I think this commander is really cool. I think it's really interesting and cool. You're going to see a lot of the cards from the Necron deck in this review, and to me, it's like pretty clear that that is the most pushed deck. And it makes sense because artifacts tend to be some of the most broken stuff. So it makes sense that they would have an easy time just kind of popping off. All right, Celestine the Living Saint. This I'm bringing up because it keeps getting brought up to me as a card for Winota. I'm currently on the Rest in Peace build of Winota, so I'm not a big fan of Celestine because it just brings creatures back from the graveyard. So it says, at the beginning of my end step, return a creature with mana value X or less from your graveyard to the battlefield, or X the amount of life you gain this turn. So hypothetically speaking, you flip this over with a Winota trigger, you hit them for 3, and then at the end step, you can bring back something with CMC 3 or less. I don't think including another 5-drop to gunk up the top end of your Winota deck to play this card for recurring some kind of minimal cards is really worth it. I know there's some people who've been testing it and then said it's done decently enough for them. I'm still hesitant on it, and I don't think, as I said, we can really afford another clunky 5-drop, especially given how much just like versatility and like flexibility we need to be able to like have consistent solid early games. So while I can see the ability for Celestine to have value, and I like the fact that it comes in has evasion and like can do the thing, that's awesome. It just doesn't mean that that's what I think the deck needs to be going for or pushing towards for win cons. Excellus Prater. I know some people were talking about this card just in general. Giving your commanders protection from everything with flash is like decent for sure. I don't love it. I don't think it's fantastic. I definitely don't think it's a Winota card. I know some people were talking about that initially when it was spoiled. I think a lot of the talk has kind of died down from that. The card's fine, but 4 mana is a big ask for this card. Even like in any white deck, whether it's multiple colors, whether it's mono white, I think 4 mana is a lot to ask for this effect. And while it's a solid effect, I think we can expect more from our cards than this. Mono black legend number 2, another Necron. We have Anrakir, the Traveler. When it attacks, you may cast an artifact spell from your hand or graveyard by paying life equal to its mana value rather than its mana cost. So hypothetically speaking, you entomb a Bolas' Citadel, you go to combat with this, you pay 6 life, and you got a Bolas' Citadel onto the battlefield. I think that's like the interaction most people are thinking of when you think of this card. It's kind of weird because you want to be playing like Ad Nauseam Pure, Bolas' Citadel type effects, but you also want to have big artifacts in your graveyard so you can pay a bunch of life and just like dump some ridiculous cards onto the battlefield with this creature's effect. I don't really love this card, but it obviously does inherently strong things, so that's kind of why I'm mentioning it here. And you know, if you want to play a mono black turbo Bolas' Citadel, this is definitely an avenue to do that for sure. I think this card has the potential to do some crazy stuff, but I don't think it's like revolutionary by any means. And 5 mana that needs to go to combat without any sort of haste or, you know, flash effects, I think it definitely leaves a lot to be wanting, but it's definitely, like, as I said, it does an inherently busted thing if you get it to do its thing. So this is one of those cards that I know is fundamentally broken, but I can't tell you why it, or like what it does specifically that is that. So this is Biotransference. It's an enchantment. Creature you control are artifacts in addition to the types. Same is true for creature spells you control and creatures you own that aren't on the battlefield. And whenever you cast an artifact, you lose a life and create a 2/2 black Necron warrior artifact creature token. So creatures for the rest of the game, whether they're artifact creatures or not, inherently are creating a body whenever you cast them and docking you a life, which is the thing. And also that's just any artifact spell on top of that. Like this thing is just creating a bunch of bodies. Anytime like you cast a Mox Opal, you lose a life and make a 2/2. Like that's definitely strong. But the strong part about this card definitely is the fact that your creatures are artifacts everywhere. And whenever you have an effect like this, kind of like Painter's Servant, where you're fundamentally changing the quality of cards in a certain place that's not on the battlefield, you can do some pretty busted stuff with it. As I mentioned, I know this is a broken effect. I don't know what the outlet for this fundamentally broken thing is, but this feels like a card that you go, oh yeah, this is dumb because X, Y, or Z, and you have a solution there. I as I said, I haven't spent the time to like crack this card because it's not like the avenue that I feel like I need to pursue this Biotransference deck, but it does, once again, an inherently busted thing. I'm just waiting for someone to be like, oh, this is the crazy Biotransference thing that we didn't think about. And it's going to feel like, ah, yes, of course. How do we not realize this card is absolutely cracked? So very strong effect, does some really fundamentally broken things. Interested to see what people do with it. And here, a legendary artifact creature from the Necron deck. Am I starting to sound like a broken record yet? This is Illuminaris Xeris. Sure. Sacrifice another creature. For tapping it, add an amount of black mana equal to that creature's mana value. This is just a really solid effect. I know for a period of time people were playing the Spell Shaper that does the same thing, except for it sacrifices itself, and you have to discard a card to make triple black mana, like the creature Dark Ritual. This card just seems like a better version of that. It's really interesting with cards like Dargo, because the front half lets you sack some of your dorkier creatures to like get mana for Dargo and like cast that card, and then it you know, when this doesn't have Summoning Sickness, this becomes like a Burning Inquiry for Dargo, or more realistically like a sacrifice. So this does some really good stuff, you know, being able to sacrifice a card like Dargo for 7 black mana and then casting your Peer off of this is pretty strong. But also in like the fair case, if you're playing more of like a mid-rangey sort of Ad Nauseam style deck, playing this card and then sacrificing a card like your own Timna in a blue farm deck to make 3 black mana to help you cast an Adnaz with the ability to hold up more mana for protection strikes me as a very solid upside for this card. I also really like this in decks like the Timna Ikra variant, because Ikra like can gain you some life, but then after a while, like you're like, oh, the use of this card is done. Make me 5 mana now, so I can cast my Adnaz and then still have the rest of my mana untapped. So for me, this card seems like it has a lot of potential in places where black mana is most often used, which tends to be these sort of more aggressive ad nauseum, either mid-range ad nauseum or turbo ad nauseum style shells. The Illuminor is definitely pretty strong in that effect. It also a Sac Outlet for Protean Hulk. I don't see how that, like, this does anything special for that archetype, but you know, I could definitely see some more black sacrifice strategies playing this card as well without having to be like full on the ad nauseum train. Out of the Tombs is a weird one, but a cool one. It is an enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, put 2 Aeon counters on it. Then mill cards equal the Aeon counters on it. So, you know, first turn you mill 2, second turn, I guess first turn you play it, doesn't do anything. Second turn, your upkeep, mill 2. Third turn, put 2 more counters, mill 4, etc., etc. And then it says, if you would draw a card while your library is empty, here's some Labman text. Instead, return a creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. If you can't, you lose the game. So hypothetically speaking, you mill your entire library, you have this card on the battlefield, you go to draw, and then you reanimate your Thassa's Oracle. Something to that effect. Or your Necrotic Ooze, or something like that. Dread Return is probably just better than this card in a lot of situations, but I can see if you're already playing a card like Mesmeric Orb in your black deck that cares about self-mill, I can see that maybe this card would have some utility. I don't think this is like one of the strongest effects, and I think the general clunkiness of it may keep it out of cEDH viability, but it's definitely a cool card and it definitely does some powerful things. But as I said, it's just a little clunky all around to make it not like broken, and you need cEDH cards to be broken, and that's not what I'm sure this is. And yet another card with an inherently busted effect that I'm not sure exactly where it's gonna go. We have Poxwalkers. It is a 3/1 Death Touch for 3, and it says whenever you cast a spell from anywhere other than your hand, you can return it from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. So this is another like prized amalgam effect. It's got that whole like dredge text to it. The fact that it's only in black is pretty huge, because prized amalgam being in blue has meant it hasn't been relevant for a lot of like commander dredge decks. Like blue black isn't normally like the dredge color in commander. This is obviously like super cool in like a casual list, but I can easily see this especially in like some type of self-mill strategy, some type of hermit druid like thing where you're milling your entire library, you're casting something that is going to be another thing you sacrifice for dread return out of your graveyard, and then Poxwalkers just comes back for free, and it comes back right away. So it definitely, like, it's an inherently powerful ability to just have this effect to be able to pull it back out. It's also really cool with something like Gravecrawler, because it's now like this, it's a zombie that makes you able to cast Gravecrawler, and it also like triggers off of Gravecrawler. So it does some pretty strong things. I don't know exactly what it's going to be doing. Having a card like this that exists makes combos more likely to happen. Whatever those combos may or may not be, kind of depends on what's happening in the format right now and what your deck is trying to do. But the fact that this card exists opens up more infinite combos. So we'll see from there. Razin the Infinite. This commander is so cool. Alan and Mental Misplay already released a sort of quick deck tech about this card. I think this card's really, really strong. I really am excited to brew around it. Like the idea that you cast a Buried Alive and then your commander and then you just win the game is pretty cool to me. For those curious, you just play Phyrexian Devourer and Walking Ballista and you win with your commander. So having a 2-card combo with Buried Alive is obviously very strong. Now you need enough converted mana cost in your deck to make it so that combo works. For those curious, basically the way it works is that you exile top cards of your library, adding counters to your commander, and then you remove those counters because of the Walking Ballista ability to ping your opponents down, but you need to have mana value greater than the life total of all 3 of your opponents in your deck to be able to utilize that combo. And that's just like the summoning sickness proof combo that exists, but there are just so many. Like, there's the reason that they call this card the Infinite, because there are just so many incidental infinite combos that you can do with this commander. A lot of them require you not to have summoning sickness, which is why I mentioned the Ballista Devourer combo specifically, because that one avoids summoning sickness removal. And when you get to like what this card can do without summoning sickness, the world becomes your oyster. This card's really cool. I think like incidental mill to just turn your commander into this like insane toolbox is pretty cool. There's lots to like about this card. Also legendary artifact creature Necron. There's so many of them in this set that are just like really, really cool. The Necron deck crushed it for a cEDH player, in my opinion. I think if you are going to buy one of these decks and you're a cEDH player, you buy this deck so quickly. It's the Necron deck for 100% sure, which is ironic because like the face commander is kind of bad. But yeah, this card just, you sneeze and it goes infinite, and that's pretty cool. So yeah, big fan of this card. I mentioned this card because this is the obligatory Isochron Scepter outlet of Azorius. You tap 2 untapped artifacts you control to create a 2/2 Astartes, and then you tap X untapped creatures you control to look at the top X cards of your library, and you can put an artifact from among them into your hand. Basically, if you have 2 artifacts, you can do the whole make infinite mana to make the infinite untaps thing. And if you're not even, you can actually tap this creature to just basically look at a card every single time, put them all on the bottom, and then eventually you'll get enough artifacts where you can play them out, make infinite mana with the Isochron Scepter, yada yada yada. This card needs to not have summoning sickness to be an infinite mana outlet with Isochron Scepter, so it's not that great, and the general ability on it is fine. If you wanted to play like a sort of artifact or staxier version of an Isochron Scepter deck, this is a kind of unique version of that effect. And because of that, I think it's kind of worth at least mentioning here. It's definitely a weird card for sure, and it definitely does a lot of things in a strange way. I don't like that it doesn't do anything without summoning sickness. Without summoning sickness, it's just a 4-mana 2/4. But when you untap on your next turn, it then starts to do some really unique stuff. And that just might mean you need to play a couple effects in your deck that are artifacts that allow you to have haste, right? So like a Lightning Greaves is kind of interesting in this deck because equipment don't tap when your creature taps, right? So like if you have one other artifact, you put Lightning Greaves on this when it comes down, you tap Lightning Greaves and the one other artifact, and you're already using your commander to make a 2/2 warrior, which is kind of cute. Yeah, this card just does enough things on its own, enough small things that make it so it's like, it's not necessarily a bad card, and it might have a shell. As I said, like an artifact stacks commander is kind of where I see it. I can also see the mid-range, but I think if the bodies on the card are relevant, that might be where you kind of like use this card the most. Also, if you have... Yeah, so with 2 artifact creatures and your commander and Intruder Alarm, that allows you to make infinite creatures. That's kind of cool. So yeah, if you have 2 artifact creatures, you tap your commander and the 2 artifact creatures to make the Astartes warrior. You untap because of Intruder Alarm, and then you just keep doing that, which is kind of cool. That's a neat interaction. So yeah, so it's not only an Isochron Scepter outlet, but it's also an Intruder Alarm combo if you're playing artifact creatures, which, like, you know, there's enough cards that are not bad that are also artifact creatures that it may be a stacks effect, something like Phyrexian Revoker or stuff like that. It's kind of interesting. You know, you kind of want Walking Ballista as an outlet in this deck anyways, so it's definitely, like, cute for sure. It's a cute card with some unique stuff to it, so it's enough worth talking about, and I'm interested to see if this ever actually becomes a thing, because, as I said, it's enough small things that I think it's not necessarily bad. Chaos Mutation! We got another one. This is an instant speed polymorph that also hits your opponent's creatures if there are stacks pieces stopping you from winning the game. Yeah, it's not like there's not really much else to say, but this is just like a new and really solid new polymorph effect. Once again, that's an instant, because the only other instant we had until now was Divergent Transformations, and it makes Divergent Transformation strategies actually more playable now, because this is also, along with Divergent Transformations, another effect that can hit multiple creatures. So beforehand, if you wanted to polymorph 2 cards to win the game, like Divergent Transformations asks you to do, you only had Divergent that did that effect, but this actually polymorphs multiple cards at instant speed. So as far as like a lot of the cards we talked about, like a lot of things made their own archetype, but this is the first card that is like just an upgraded version of an effect we've already really wanted that is super playable. So I'm actually really excited about this card existing because the second Divergent Transformations opens up a lot of creative space. And for those who don't know, I went through like a really big Teamer Polytyrant kick for like a really long time. So being able to kind of have a reason to like go back to playing that deck that I really, really enjoyed is just like icing on top of the cake for me. So very excited to have this new polymorph effect in the format. Canupt Tech Tomb Sentinel. This is a 4/3 Vigilance. When it comes into the battlefield from a graveyard, you can exile up to 1 non-land permanent, and it has Unearth for 7 generic mana. The reason I chose to mention this card is because in decks that do not have the ability to have flexible removal that also care about the graveyard, this deck's actually, or this card is very interesting. So I really like this in a deck that is trying to like, for example, like a black deck that is trying to remove enchantments like Rest in Peace, or I guess Rest in Peace is a bad example because you can't bring this back from the graveyard if it's been exiled, but there are definitely like problem enchantments that would be really interesting to like have this card come out of the graveyard, and in colors that can't really fix anything like that, have that be relevant. A deck like Duretti comes to mind, because Duretti is constantly pulling artifacts in and out of the graveyard, and the idea that you can like sack, I don't know, a Soul Ring and like bring this out and exile a problematic enchantment that's stopping you winning the game. For example, like a Stony Silence. That's huge. Like normally red can't deal with that apart from like Chaos Warp or a Wild Magic Surge. So the fact that there is another option that exists, and also just like a card that does the whole Duretti thing where you can like sack it, bring it back, sack it, bring it back, and start like this loop over and over again, the Goblin Welder thing. This card's kind of interesting for that purpose. So I'm interested to see if it actually does see play. I think if, you know, Duretti is still a deck, like this is a place to play in it. Not that it's like it is a deck that exists. It's whether people are going to play it. The Golden Throne. This is kind of interesting. It's a legendary artifact. It says if you lose the game, exile it, and your electoral becomes 1, and you can pay to sack a creature and add 3 mana of any combination of colors. So I'm very interested in this one specifically because we've had effects like this before where like if you lose the game, you exile that card instead. But they also haven't been things that have an effect on them apart from that ability. So the fact that this one is a Sac Outlet and a mana producer makes me more interested in it than previous iterations of this effect. So I don't really know the place for it specifically, but the fact that we have this like stacks piece that says I cannot lose the game once, and then have this ability to make mana and or be a Sac Outlet, I think it does enough things where it may be relevant to a deck. And now Scepter of Eternal Glory. For those Niv Mizzet fans out there, or those you know, Mono Blue Teferi fans out there, we have a 4 mana artifact. It says add 1 mana of any color to tap it, or add 3 mana of any one color for only 4 mana. Only activate if you control 3 or more lands with the same name. So as I mentioned, that Mono Blue Teferi deck, this is literally like the best card ever printed for that deck in recent memory. So like that's insane in that deck. Obviously it's not an extremely relevant deck, but it also is a deck that just won the Cash Cards event. So that is definitely a relevant now, I guess, line of text for a certain archetype. But I also know Niv Mizzet tends to play a ton of basic lands, and despite the fact that like it plays a lot of duels, it's also like a Blood Moon deck. So the fact that like that is a deck that I can easily see having 3 basic islands, playing this card, and then, you know, being able to hold up 3 blue for interaction until your next turn, in which you can go like make 3 red, use those islands I was just talking about to play Niv Mizzet and still have a bunch of mana up. This card seems really good. Any low color deck that cares about mana rocks that produce a bunch of mana, so any low color Isochron Scepter decks, I could see playing this. Yeah, I mean, 3 of a color is really strong for 4 mana. Gilded Lotus like saw play forever ago in some certain archetypes, but like I can definitely see some like mono blue decks picking this card up, especially if you're like using Isochron Scepter as an outlet in your deck, because that's just, it's a 1 card Isochron Scepter outlet. So this card's actually really interesting for that space. Obviously the restriction makes it cool, because if it was just the second line of text without any restriction, the card would just be like, oh yeah, this card's really good and it's going to see play in certain decks. Oh, this is also a Godo card, I think, right? Like Godo is always fiending for these cards. It's been playing Thran Dynamo for a year, so this in Godo is just like, oh hey, here's a better Thran Dynamo. Most of the time, obviously there are non-basic lands in Godo that would make you want to play those, but like this just seems like such a cool and powerful card. And any card that like makes lower color decks just a little better is always a card I enjoy, because the more balanced the color pie feels in the format, the more healthy the metagame feels and the more diverse strategies exist. So a card like this that promotes these lower color decks is always going to be one that I'm really into. So cool card, definitely very interesting, and I'm excited to see it play. Well, everybody, that concludes our Warhammer 40k set review. Once again, tell me if there's cards that I missed that you think are like snap includes that are from this series of commander decks. It's definitely really interesting to see. I definitely think the Necron deck is by far the deck with the most playable cards in these commander decks. Yeah, and if you disagree with me on that, I would love to hear people's opinions, because the Necron deck seems like it's pretty pat. I also think like I would definitely be interested to see what people think of Marnius Calgar, and whether you think my stacks variant of that deck is the way to go with it, or if you're convinced that like the mid-range Smothering Tithe version. Now, don't get me wrong, the Smothering Tithe will be in the stacks version of that deck, but if you think a more mid-range version of that deck is more relevant, like you want to lean heavily onto Icecrown Scepter, I'd love to hear stuff like that in the comments down below. Thank you all for watching. Thank you to the patrons who help keep this channel going and growing. If you would like to join those supporters and have deck techs on this channel, if you would like to be a part of the team that chooses what I play at certain tournaments, if you'd like to be the people who have their fantastic names displayed in the show notes that are about to show up on this screen, head over to patreon.com/comedianmtg. It helps out the channel so much. It helps me to be able to continually produce this quality content for you all, and it helps me get out to the events that in the tournaments that are now, since COVID is at least dwindling, the Patreon is a huge help for me to be able to go and attend these tournaments and give you real life reactions to the things that are happening in our meta, in the tournaments, in the entire cEDH tournament scene. So thank you to the patrons, and thank you to all you out here in the audience, whether you're a patron or not. Please make sure to hit like and subscribe though, because those things are free and they help out the channel so much. Thank you all. Just really appreciate everyone. And everybody, November 11th through the 13th, you can find me in Salt Lake City at the Magic Summit. This looks to be an insane event with tons of content creators from the 60 card competitive space all the way to cEDH creators. There's folks like myself playing with Power, and then a slew of other people like the Professor, Reed Duke, Pleasant Kenobi. So many people going to this event. It's going to be crazy, and it's going to be a really, really fun time. So make sure to check out the MTG Summit. And if you sign up, if you buy a ticket, and you use the code Ian, as you can see right there on your screen, it actually helps me a ton to be able to go to this event. So if you are planning on going to the summit anyways and you want to type in code Ian, it would help me a huge amount, and it actually takes a little bit off of your order. So consider doing that. All right, everybody. Thank you for watching. Have an amazing week. Catch you next time. Peace.
I can feel the blood creeping up from the heathens. Got will, got fight, got pride, got reason. If they wanna go eat, then you know I'm gonna feed them. If you're coming for me, hope you're ready for a demon. I got eyes in the back of my head, I'm seeing. Take me for granted and you know I'm leaving. I'ma take what's mine with the webs I'm weaving. I could take this crowd from seeing to believing. Got a taste for blood and my tongue keeps bleeding from the words I spit. So sharp, so freezing, so cold.